The story that I'd like to share with you today is actually a pretty long story, and I'm going to summarize it as best I can. But it's a long story because Abram and Sarai actually lived to be pretty old. In fact, the story in the Bible starts when they're already pretty old, and I'll let you decide what old means. But at this point in Abram's life, God invited him to pick up everything and to move, to go a new place and start again. God promised to make of him a great nation, to give him many descendants. And so Abram went an awful lot of different places, experienced an awful lot of different things, and he always remembered that promise of God. But what Abram struggled with was believing that God would follow through. And so Abram asked God to repeat the promise a lot of times, like a child who asks a parent over and over, "Do you love me?" Less because they don't trust, but more because they need to hear it again. And God would say to Abraham, "Look up at the stars and count them." And of course, Abram couldn't. And God said, "So numerous shall your descendants be." God did that a couple times. A couple other times, God had Abram do these rituals, things that probably aren't fitting for dinner conversation. And Abram continued to wander. He traveled all over the place, but each and every place he went, he really still struggled to trust that God would follow through. In fact, he actually lied quite a bit. Several of the places that he went, he lied about his wife, Sarah, and who she was. Because the reality is he was worried that he wasn't going to survive, that he wasn't going to make it through that experience. He didn't think that God would see him through. As he continued to get older and older, Abram still didn't have any heirs, didn't have any children to have these descendants that God had promised. And so Abram, like his great super great grandparents and Adam and Eve, decided to take things into his own hands. And Abram had a son by his wife's maid, Hagar. God had other things in mind for Abram, but this son, Ishmael, was born of distrust. And so God let Abram know that this would not be his heir. God still saw and provided for Ishmael and his mom, Hagar. But that's not the end of the story. Once again, God reiterates the promise to Abram. God sends 3 angels to visit him and Sarai. And they remind him of the promise, and they say, in fact, Sarah is going to have a child. And Sarah was really beyond childbearing age. And again, I'll let you decide what age that might be. But what they did when they heard this is they laughed. They thought it was ridiculous. It was impossible. Though it seemed like it took a long time, God does the impossible. God always does. And Sarai had a baby. When he was born, they named him Isaac. Isaac is a name that means laughter, because God had changed their incredulous laughter into a laughter of joy. They were so changed in their lives that they even got new names, Abraham and Sarah. And Isaac, he grew up. Life was good until the really hard part of this story, when God told Abraham to sacrifice Isaac on an altar. Now, this doesn't sound like God, that God would want child sacrifice. I'm going to tell you, it's not what God is like. Because this isn't about child sacrifice, this is about trust. Because when Abraham agreed to do it, when he went on that journey and took his son with him, it was the very first time that Abraham actually trusted God. That he actually put his own life in the hands of God. And it was a confusing thing, He didn't understand the means of what God was doing, but he trusted the end. And if God promised that it would be okay in the end, he had learned that it will. Now, God obviously stopped the sacrifice before it could happen, thankfully. Again, God has no desire for that kind of thing. And life continued. And Abraham had many descendants. And I will say, if you think the family relationship was a bit complicated between Abraham and Isaac after that whole sacrifice thing, know that it doesn't end there. Just wait till tomorrow when I tell you the story about their grandsons, Jacob and Esau.